in a time of growing oligarchy, of dark money and all types of money perverting the political process, in a time of mass media delusion and deception, how do people take back power for themselves? How do we turn around the instrumentality of state, and for that matter, of other aspects of society and the economy as well, and point them in a wiser and more humane direction? My next guest has written about this before. She's the author of the book Direct Action, Protest, and the Reinvention of American Radicalism, which I, for one, want to see reinvented over and over. We had her on to talk about that. She has a new book out now. She says, by the way, RJ Kauffman, who's my next guest, says that protests work, but maybe not the way you think. And I want to talk to her about that. She's been an organizer for more than 30 years. She was the mobilizing coordinator of the protests, the mass protests against the Iraq invasion and war in 2003, 2004, which were massive. You just wouldn't know it if you watched the mainstream media that basically conducted a blackout on it. And she's also covered social movements and activism for a number of magazines. But she is here now to talk about her new book, and I want to get the title exactly right: How to Read a Protest. Oh, great. Kindle, this website here is cutting off. The Art of Organizing and Resistance. Got it. RJ Kauffman, thank you for joining us.
Having me.
So let's start with this. The 30-second description of your book.
It's an exploration of how, when, and why protests work and how that's changed over time.
Okay, and they, as you clearly conclude, they do work. But what do you mean by not necessarily in the way that you think that one might think they work?
Well, first of all, I distinguish between kinds of protests because there's a huge menu of forms of protest, and people tend to lump them all together. There's a difference between the kind of protest that is a nonviolent direct action, like the famous lunch counter sit-in, and a mass march, like the '63 March on Washington, where Dr. King gave the I Have a Dream speech. And those protests, they come together differently, and they have different effects over time. A lot of people, when they look at a protest and they are trying to evaluate whether it worked or not, they evaluate it by one narrow standard, which is, did it work in the short term as a pressure tactic? So, whatever the demand of the protest was, did they achieve their demand right away? And if that's the standard that you use, which is often the standard that the mainstream media will use, there'll be, a million people around the country marching against gun violence, and there'll be 2 days later a whole bunch of stories. Well, did the protests change anything? And I'm stepping back from that framework to look at the role of protests in building movements, because as a longtime organizer, I know you don't win through any single action or any single protest. When you are winning, particularly if you're trying to win something big, you win through a long-term process of building pressure and applying pressure at many points. And protests are just one of the tools that we use to do that.
So when you think about creating change over time and building movements, you build movements, in my opinion, but of course I want to know your thoughts. You build movements by raising awareness or raising consciousness, as we used to say. You build movements, I think, to a large extent by creating a sense of community, a sense of lasting community, and by giving the participants of that movement a sense of purpose and meaning in life that we don't have, in most cases, what is sometimes called alienation, that we don't have when we are not part of something greater than themselves. Those are the thoughts that come to mind, but what's your thinking?
Yeah, absolutely. But then even within that, there are differences in how movements have approached exactly that question and what the outcomes have been. In my new book, I contrast the way that the 1963 March on Washington, which is the most famous protest in American history, was organized, with the 2017 women's marches, which kicked off the current era of protest and resistance against Trump. And there were very different organizing models for those two mobilizations and very different results. The 63 March on Washington, obviously, it continues to inspire. It was a landmark event. But when you go back, I went into the archives and you look at how it worked as a movement building event, and it really didn't. It really, if you look at the specific organizations that hold that mobilization together, they put so much into getting people to Washington that they were kind of exhausted afterwards. They couldn't incorporate about at least half the crowd with people who hadn't belonged to civil rights organizations before. And you would think, oh, this would be a moment when those people could be brought in the NAACP and CORE and all of these other groups would grow with that kind of sense of community you were invoking. And it really didn't happen. My own experience as an organizer is a clue to why, and it's because the organizers were exhausted after doing that mobilization. They did it in a very top-down way. It was a very classic, almost old left style of mobilization. Women did most of the work of actually getting the people there, but they were completely marginalized from the decision-making process. In my contrast, when the women's marches came together in January of 2017, right after Donald Trump's inauguration, those didn't come together in the traditional way. There was no organization that made them happen. They were like a viral groundswell. And through the process of putting them together, people came together in that kind of community you're talking about and formed what are now at least 5,000 resistance groups all around the country. So there's a way in which the resistance to Trump, was fashioned in part out of the sense of community that people felt when they went to those extraordinary women's marches right after Donald Trump's inauguration.
You know, I think that's, from my personal impressions and experience, I think that's so on the money. I have to tell you, LA, that when I went to the Women's March, which I did here in Washington, I did it with a great deal of trepidation. And the reason why I had trepidation was because some of the advanced publicity had sort of implied, well, pantsuit nation, which is a tribute to a politician with an ideology I don't necessarily share, and I'm not comfortable with movements idealizing individuals, especially, political figures. And so I had a little bit of concern about that and whether it would be inclusive and change-oriented and communitarian. And I've got to tell you, I was 6 feet off the ground for most of that. I was energized. I felt part of a community. I felt part of something greater than myself. All of the things I was talking about. I think part of what you're saying, if I understand correctly, is that response, which I think was shared by an enormous number of people, not just in Washington, not just in the United States, but around the world who went to women's marches. I think you're saying that in large part was, if I understand correctly, was because it was a communitarian effort as well as a communitarian march. Am I saying it sort of right?
Yeah, I mean, it was a very, very organic, decentralized groundswell. Compared to times when we've had mobilizations where it's one big march in Washington, there was the one massive event in Washington. I was there as well. But there were hundreds of others around the country. I don't have the figure right at hand. I think it's 650, much, much higher than any previous number of coordinated protests around the U.S. I've been involved over the years in various efforts where we had, a day of action against the Iraq War. There's been many times when there were these coordinated protests, and they usually maxed out at about 200 cities. With the Women's March, there was, all over the country, in tiny places everywhere, there were record turnouts of people just feeling so moved to come out and be together. And there was also part of what I look at in the book is I look at how protest signs are a clue to how a protest is coming together and what it accomplishes. And part of what was distinctive about the women's marches was everybody made their own signs. There was this incredible proliferation of messages that reflected a claiming of voice, a claiming of political space and voice at this very dangerous moment in American history. That I think all of us who were at any of those marches felt the power of that. Just looking around at all the messages that people, very heartfelt, that people brought with them. They weren't just carrying signs that somebody else had printed and handed out. They were sharing their deeply felt sentiments about this crucial conjuncture.
And I want to make another point. And again, we're talking with How to Read a Protest, the author of How to Read a Protest, The Art of Organizing and Resistance, R.J. Kauffman. And another thing, well, it hadn't been articulated at that point. It was just one day into the Trump presidency. There was something, for lack of a better term, life-affirming. There was something affirmative, deeply affirmative about those protests. My other source of anxiety, not anxiety, but trepidation was this just going to be about how much we hate Trump? And the energy in those marches was very much positive. And that gets me to another point, a phrase that I've been using since the election of 2016 is that we have to move beyond resistance, that we have to we have to stand for something, not just keep articulating our dislike for an individual or even an individual in a party, but sort of a vision. I feel as if a movement, as opposed to a protest, can only be built if what you are opposed to is matched or exceeded by a vision of what you stand for. Does that make any sense to you?
Yeah, absolutely. That idea of either prefiguring the world you want to create, or standing, holding a torch for a vision that you'd love to see implemented. That's one of the powerful functions that a protest can serve. And those women's marches were specifically framed as not being anti-Trump. They were something else. They were, in favor of a very different vision of America. And I want to underscore that had a lot to do with the fact that these were women's marches, and that this is a moment where, women have been the strong majority of every aspect of resistance to Trump. If you look at who's marching, if you look at who's making the phone calls, who's out canvassing right now for the midterms, any aspect who's formed resistance groups, anything you look at, it ranges from 60 to 85% women. The protests against Kavanaugh, those were overwhelmingly women. And there's a way in which women have really taken the lead in staking out this vision of a broad, multi-issue, progressive future right now. And that's where the leadership and the vision has been the strongest in this period. I think it's not accidental. I think that Donald Trump and the Trump administration are, among other things, holding forward a very toxic vision of white masculinity that certainly many progressive men don't agree with, and that the majority of us don't agree with. So there's a gender divide there. But I think that feeling of positivity and openness and inclusion that a lot of people felt in the women's marches has in part to do with the feminist organizing models that they were carrying forward.
Yeah, I think that's very much true, and it seems to me to stand the kind of woman-led movement that you're describing is very different from, let's say, breaking the glass ceiling or leaning in or some of the other. It seems to me because of the collective dimension. Or am I reading too much into it, or does that make sense to you? That it's
it's a very different model of feminism. It's an intersectional feminism that foregrounds those who are most affected by oppression. It has a model that's based in a really radical view of identity politics that came out of Black feminism, which is, which is kind of the shorthand for which is, if Black women are free, everyone will be free. It's this idea that if you take leadership from those who have been the most affected by multiple forms of oppression. You're going to develop a politics that includes the most people and that speaks to the broadest range of issues. And that's very different from the sort of neoliberal corporate, a female face on, putting a female face or a person of color face to the same kind of neoliberal practices and policies. This is a much more transformative vision coming out of this organic grassroots feminist movement of our time.
Well, it's an exciting, if a perilous time to be alive, I guess. And, that's where life gets its meaning, I guess, is if you live in times when you're needed, when you can contribute, when you can make a difference. And so I encourage everyone to read LA's book. The book is How to Read a Protest, The Art of Organizing and Resistance. I wish we had more time to talk about it, but L.A. Kauffman, thanks for writing the book, and thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks so much for having me, Richard.